You'd think you know what a medieval tavern looked like. Warm fire, wooden mugs, laughing peasants. You've seen the paintings. Every single image in your head is wrong. Medieval taverns were not drinking spots. They were violent hotspots filled with crime, disease, and forbidden dealings disguised as hospitality. And what you're about to hear has been buried under centuries of nostalgia. These are 22 dark secrets of medieval taverns, and by the end, you will never romanticize the past again. Historians call medieval taverns the beating heart of community life. They were right, but a beating heart can also pump poison. For medieval Europeans, the tavern was inescapable. It was where you drank, slept, got cheated, infected, and sometimes killed. Let's get into it, starting at number 22. Number 22, the ale was laced with mold that caused hallucinations. The grain used to brew ale was stored in damp, rotting storehouses, almost always contaminated with ergot fungus, which produces compounds chemically related to LSD. Patrons weren't just getting drunk, they were hallucinating, convulsing. In high doses, ergot caused gangrene, limbs blackening off while the victim was still alive. Medieval people called it St. Anthony's fire. They thought it was God's punishment. Then they went back to the same tavern. The tavern keeper knew the grain was bad. He brewed it anyway. Number 21. Sleeping there meant sleeping with corpses. Travelers shared beds, 3 or 4 strangers pressed together, sick and healthy alike. Plague victims, bleeding men from road violence. If someone died in the night, the body was often left until morning. Space was space. One documented English inn disposed of 11 guest bodies in a single season without notifying a single authority. The guests the following week slept on the same straw. Number 19. The water was more lethal than the ale. People drank ale in medieval times not out of preference, but because the local water was running through the river that received the town's waste, the tannery runoff, and the butcher's drain. Drinking it meant cholera. It meant death in days. Ale had been boiled during brewing. It was accidentally safer. But here's where it turns dark. Greedy tavern keepers watered down their ale to stretch supply, using whatever water was nearby. They were serving their customers the very thing that was killing the town, diluted into every cup for profit. Number 18. Gambling debts were paid with human beings. When a man ran out of coins at the dice table, and those games were almost universally rigged, he had other options: his horse, his tools, his land, and in documented cases from medieval France and England, the labor of his wife, his children, or himself. There are court records from 13th century France of men suing to recover family members pledged at tavern dice tables who were never returned. Number 17. The tavern keeper was a paid government spy. You thought the tavern was a place of freedom, somewhere outside authorities' reach. The tavern keeper was often on the government's payroll to report everything you said. In England, alehouse licenses came with conditions. Keepers were required to report seditious speech, heretical conversation, talk of rebellion. Several of England's biggest heresy prosecutions of the 14th century started not from church investigations, but from tavern reports. Every whispered secret over a cup of ale had a listener behind a bar. Number 16. The food was rotten. That was the business model. Tavern keepers aged meat well past any safe threshold, then buried it in heavy spicing, pepper, cloves, cinnamon, to mask the smell. Spices cost more than silver. They could sell unsellable meat at a profit. The spices didn't kill the bacteria, they just hid them. A traveler who got violently ill on the road the next day had no way to connect it to the meal. The tavern keeper faced 0 consequences. The next traveler sat at the same table. Number 15. Taverns were the medieval world's preferred assassination venues. When nobles needed someone dead, they didn't send men to castles, they sent them to taverns. The logic was clean. Strangers were unremarkable. Every man traveled armed. A body found in the morning looked like a brawl. No one was surprised by violence. Court records from across Europe document this pattern. Hired killers were briefed at inns. Poison was administered over drinks. The tavern was not a place of refuge, it was a killing floor that had learned to smile. Number 14. The church's loudest critics of taverns were its biggest customers. Priests condemned taverns from pulpits every Sunday, then they went to them every other night. Church court records from medieval England are packed with clergy cited for habitual tavern attendance, public drunkenness, brawling, and conduct with women that the documents describe in careful Latin euphemism. Monks climbed over monastic walls at night. Friars had arrangements with specific keepers who guaranteed their visits stayed quiet. In some towns, the local priest was the tavern's single largest customer by volume consumed. The institution that condemned the tavern most loudly was simultaneously funding it with tithes money. Number 13. Women there had no legal protection from anything. In medieval English law, a tavern was a disreputable place. A woman who worked there was legally presumed of low moral character, which meant crimes committed against her were treated with dramatically reduced seriousness. She couldn't effectively testify against her attacker. Her word as a tavern woman carried a built-in discount in court. Many of these women were there because they had no other option, widowed, abandoned, destitute. The legal system that branded them as immoral was the same system that had created the conditions forcing them through the door. Number 12. Taverns were the medieval world's slave markets. Throughout the medieval Mediterranean, Genoa, Marseille, Barcelona, taverns served as informal clearinghouses for the slave trade. Enslaved North Africans, Eastern Europeans, and Sub-Saharan Africans were transferred across tavern tables as brokers drank and documents were signed. The Venetian slave trade of the 13th and 14th centuries ran substantially through waterfront tavern networks. The cheerful tavern of the popular imagination and the slave market occupied the same building, sometimes the same room. Number 11. The ale contained psychoactive herbs the church later banned. Before hops, medieval brewers used a blend called Groot, which frequently included henbane, wormwood, hemp, and nightshade. Medieval ale wasn't just intoxicating. In certain establishments, it was deliberately mind-altering. The shift to hops-based brewing was pushed partly by church and secular authorities that found the effects of Groot ales deeply inconvenient for social control. The people didn't switch willingly, they were switched. Number 11. Tavern arson was a common financial escape. Medieval tavern keepers deep in debt would burn their own establishments and collect compensation while escaping their obligations. English legal records prosecute this practice from the 12th century onward. What makes it monstrous, these fires rarely stayed contained. Timber towns burned whole districts. A tavern keeper who torched his building at night with guests sleeping made a calculated decision about how many lives his debt was worth. Several major medieval urban fires were later attributed in contemporary accounts to deliberate tavern arson. Number 10. The tab was engineered as a debt trap. Running a tab feels like courtesy. It has always been a leash. A man who owed the tavern keeper several weeks of wages didn't challenge him, didn't report him, didn't ask uncomfortable questions about rigged dice or poisoned ale. Tavern keepers who held enough credit notes held real political power. They knew who was in debt, how badly, and they knew exactly what that information was worth to the local lord, the magistrate, or the moneylender. Number 8. Taverns were the engine of plague transmission. The Black Death killed 1/3 of Europe. Historians focus on trade routes and rats. They rarely focus on the tavern. Taverns were the nodes of medieval travel networks. Every merchant, soldier, and pilgrim stopped at the same establishments. They shared communal cups. Personal drinking vessels were a luxury. They slept in the same rooms, breathed the same air. One infected traveler passing through a coaching inn could expose dozens of people in a single night, all of whom would leave the next morning in different directions, carrying the disease along every road. The tavern didn't just receive plague, it distributed it. Number 8. Tavern keepers practiced unlicensed surgery. When travelers arrived wounded and no physician was available, which described almost everywhere, the tavern keeper stepped in for a fee.
Wounds were cauterized with fireplace irons heated to glowing. Bones were set by people who had watched it done once. Teeth were pulled with tools that weren't dental instruments and weren't cleaned between patients. Opium dissolved in ale was the anesthetic. Dosing was guesswork. Overdose was not uncommon. The patient who survived the surgery often died of the infection that followed. The tavern keeper issued no refunds. Number 7. Every major peasant revolt was organized in a tavern. The Lollards, the Cathars, the men who planned England's peasant revolt of 1381, the organizers of the Jacquerie in France in 1358, which saw thousands of peasants rise against the nobility in one of the most violent uprisings of the medieval period, they all met in taverns. The genius of the tavern as a conspiracy space was deniability.